Okay, so it's time to make a start. A very warm welcome to the 2025 Tore Browaldh Lecture at the School of Business, Economics and Law at the University of Gothenburg. It's great to see so many of you here, and I'm also very pleased to welcome those of you who are following the lecture online. My name is Måns Söderbom, and I am the Dean of the school. So before we begin, let me briefly mention a few practical points. This event will last for 90 minutes, with the first part being the lecture and the second part being questions and answers and discussion. And please note that the Q&A session is only open to those attending in person. Please also be aware that the event is being recorded and will be shared publicly in due course. In case of emergency, there are two exits leading to the foyer, one through the main entrance and another to the right of the control room, as seen from the stage, so that over there. There's also an emergency exit on the side of the stage, which leads up to a staircase and out through the main entrance vestibule. So let me now say a few words about the Tore Browaldh lecture series and then introduce our distinguished guest. So the Tore Browaldh lecture series is named after Dr. Tore Browaldh, who was a prominent figure in Swedish business and public life. Over the course of his long and distinguished career, he held leading positions in institutions such as Handelsbanken, AB Volvo, and the Nobel Foundation. He also served as finance attaché, civil servant, and advisor in both public and private sectors. In 1988, AB Volvo established the Tore Browaldh Foundation in recognition of his service, and the purpose is to support an annual public lecture that explores the connections between economics, economic theory, and broader questions of society, politics, and philosophy. Since its inception in 1989, the series has welcomed many distinguished speakers, including Professor Paul Krugman, who spoke here in 2009, shortly after receiving the Sveriges Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel for his work on trade and geography, and also Cecilia Malmström, then EU Commissioner for Home Affairs, who joined us in 2014. And this year, we are deeply honored to welcome Professor Claudia Goldin. Claudia Goldin is the Henry Lee Professor of Economics at Harvard University and holds the Lee and Ezpeleta Professorship of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. She was awarded the 2023 Swedish Riksbank Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel for having advanced our understanding of women's labor market outcomes. Professor Goldin is best known for her historical work on women in the US economy. An economic historian and labor economist, her research spans topics such as the female labor force, the gender earnings gap, income inequality, technological change, education, and immigration. She has shown that gender inequality in the labor market cannot be explained solely by economic growth or educational attainment. Instead, she has uncovered a web of interrelated forces: social norms, family dynamics, legislation, technology, and shifting expectations. All these have shaped women's economic participation over more than 2 centuries. And through careful empirical analysis, and perhaps with the curiosity of a historical detective, Claudia Goldin has traced the long-run evolution of women's work and earnings. Her findings reveal not a steady rise, but a U-shaped curve in labor force participation of women, a decline during the shift from agriculture to industry, followed by a rise with the expansion of the service sector and changing social norms. So the title of today's lecture, Why Women Won, may at first glance perhaps raise some eyebrows. Many of us might ask, have women really won? After all, persistent gender differences in employment, earnings, and leadership remain in virtually every society. Based on my own reading of the underlying paper with the same title, I do not expect an unconditional declaration of victory for women this afternoon. This project explores a specific part of the broader story, how and when women in the United States gained formal legal rights equal to men, in marriage, in the workplace, and in other parts of economic and social life. So as is clear from Claudia Goldin's remarkable body of research, the story of women's progress is complex, far from linear and far from complete. But understanding the milestones along the way, especially those related to legal rights and institutional change, is essential if we want to make sense of where we are today and where we may be heading. So please join me in welcoming Professor Claudia Goldin.
So thank you very, very much, and thank you for the introduction, which I will try to live up to. And thanks everyone for coming here in what looks like unusual, but I was told it was more usual weather. I came here from the very chilly and rainy Boston, so it's not unusual for me. Okay. So my presentation is about women's rights in the US after suffrage. Okay, so the question is, when did women's rights change in the US? And why did they change? Why women won rights initially had, as you'll see, much to do with the US civil rights movement. And women's rights movement awakened a large group of women and men to a set of wrongs. And in an extraordinarily brief period of time, considerable legislation was passed and various judicial decisions bolstered the laws. But the passage of some legislation invigorated an anti-feminist traditionalist movement among men, among women mainly, but also some men, but mainly women. And it's a movement that is with us today. And deep divisions have existed in the US for some time between a group I will call traditionalists and a group that I will call feminists. And for the longest time, these divisions were actually, you'll see, greater among women than between men and women. So by women's rights, I mean that the legal, political, and social rights of women are equal to those of men. And I'm going to include legal rights in the polity, the workplace, school, family, marriage, credit, social security, the military, as well as those with regard to a woman's own body. And I'm going to talk mainly about the expansion of rights. It's been a challenge to identify the impact of workplace rights legislation on women's earnings, educational attainment, access to credit, safety, and so forth. But some have done some, and I've listed some here. So I'm first going to tell the fascinating history of when women won and how they won. Civil rights and women's rights have long been intertwined and have often been at odds. In 1964, however, civil rights and women's rights came together, and a national women's rights movement emerged soon after. In the late 1960s, a tumultuous period in the US and in many other parts of the world, in the late 1960s, an overwhelming majority of Americans thought that women could be employed even if their husbands could support them, that women should be more politically active, and believe it or not, you'll see that a woman could become president of the United States. But it took a far longer time for a majority to agree that women could be employed if they had preschool-aged children, and that women should actually have an equal role in business and government. And then by the mid-1970s, after considerable legislation on women's rights had been passed, women themselves became deeply divided on whether they supported this thing called the women's movement. Men, however, at that time were not as divided. When women in particular read the title of my talk, they remark, "Really? We won?" But not that long ago, women were fired or demoted for being married, getting married, being pregnant, having children, or capable of having children. They were denied credit, they were denied mortgages, they had to use their husband's name on credit cards and on their driver's license, and that's state legislation. They had jobs that were advertised separately from those of men. They had restrictions on their work hours, the types of jobs they could take, and the conditions of those jobs. That's in state laws. They were harassed sexually as if it was normal. They were not seated on juries, once again, that's state laws, or they had to opt in or were routinely exempted, even in the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which we often think of as the American version of Sweden. Even in that place, women were actually exempted from sitting on juries until 1975. But consider the fact that no one questioned why in this very famous book and play and movie, why there were 12 angry men. And consider as well a Supreme Court case in 1961. It was a case called Hoyt versus Florida, in which a wife was found guilty of killing her abusive husband. The most liberal of all Supreme Courts in all of American history, the court that brought us cases like Brown, Miranda, Griswold, and Loving, that court determined 9-0 unanimously that because women were, and I quote from the court's decision, the center of home and family life, they could be excused from jury duty. And yet from the 1960s to the 1970s, all of the rights that I list here became guaranteed through legislation and judicial decisions. Despite the glaring facts that in the 1960s, women were not treated as the equals of men at work, in courts of law, and schools, few in America thought that they were actually discriminated against, even though they may have thought the same about blacks. Consider this Google Ngram, where the horizontal axis is years and the vertical axis is some index of the use of various terms. Consider this Google Ngram that gives counts of books in the Google American English corpus. They use the phrase racial discrimination at least once. You can see that it spikes in 1948 with the desegregation of the armed forces by President Truman, but it reaches its new plateau with the civil rights movement around 1958. Now let's add the same for the term sex or gender discrimination, the phrase. There is a 12-year lag here, and sex discrimination as a term takes off around 1970. Before then, there was almost nothing said in this corpus about sex discrimination. But if you don't like Google, let's do the same exercise using a corpus. If you don't like Google, forget about life. But And you can use do the same exercise by using a corpus of major US city newspapers. And here the spike for race discrimination occurs with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And now add the same for sex discrimination, where I've made the scale comparable to that for the Google books. There is also about a 12-year lag, and it takes off around 1970, as it did for Google books. No real difference. I'm now going to turn to the chronology of women's rights movement in the US, and I'll answer the question, what was the road from an economy and a society in which women were legally treated differently from men to one in which such treatment is illegal? Although I am not going to go through the history of suffrage, I need to start in 1908 with a very famous Supreme Court case called Muller versus Oregon. And it was a case that began the legality of laws that protected women. These were championed by individuals that at the time thought of themselves as progressives, like Louis Brandeis, pictured here as a lawyer before he got this to the Supreme Court. And they were championed to get a foot in the door for the union movement in the United States, which didn't have very much legal standing. And it was so that they could constrain employers through laws that would have been illegal under another very, very famous Supreme Court case called Lochner, because they restricted the right of labor to contract freely. So Lochner said you could not pass laws that restricted the right of labor to contract freely, but Brandeis made a case for the fact that women were in a class by themselves and there would be irreparable harm from having them work in certain manners and for certain numbers of hours. And eventually, very, very quickly, in fact, every state in the US just about passed protective legislation regarding everything you can imagine. The hours that women could work, whether they could work at night, the weights that they could lift, legally the occupations they can have, and the fact that in almost all states, in places of work, they required a seat with a back, something even I don't have here, I guess. Okay, I'm gonna get my water over here. You were allowed to have water. Okay. Now, so every state passed this. An important and influential commission on women's status was appointed by President Kennedy in 1961 because women, by the 1960 election, had become a pivotal constituency in the US. And the commission that he appointed, the commission called for the passage of the Equal Pay Act, known as the EPA at the time. Of course, then we got another EPA, which we now don't seem to have anymore, which has to do with the environment. But this commission did not call for the passage of the ERA, which is the Equal Rights Amendment, because the ERA would have led to the end of protective legislation. But this commission actually did call for a curtailment, if not the ending, of protective legislation, which it deemed incontrovertibly discriminatory. In fact, after Eleanor Roosevelt died, and she's pictured in the middle here, and she was the head of the commission. The commission was taken over by an economist named Richard Lester. And Richard Lester actually had an office in Princeton when I was there for a while, and I asked him about this, and he said that the commission looked, because Americans in the 60s, as you just saw, had no sense that there was discrimination against women. The question was, how could this commission convince them that there was? So he said the way in which we did this was simply to find the state and the federal legislation that was incontrovertibly discriminatory. It was an absolutely brilliant thing to have done. And this commission as well said that the courts should use the 14th and the 15th Amendments on account of sex, which they eventually did. So I need to digress for a moment here and return to a period of time called the 1960s. And much happened in the 1960s of relevance to my story. There was a civil rights movement, and there was also an anti-war movement. And if you look at this picture in the middle, you will see an enormous crowd on the National Mall. And if you look really, really hard at the area on the mall to the right of the mall, you will see me. This happens to have been, this was November of 1969. It was the largest US demonstration ever in American history, and you can tell that to the current president, okay. This is a real demonstration, and yes, I really was there. So both of these, the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, happening in the 1960s particularly, one in the early 60s, one more in the latter part of the 1960s, gave many women organizing talents and also demonstrating to them that their issues were not being discussed. Women learned that they too were oppressed. And this led to both a national movement and a more local grassroots women's liberation movement. And we can now return to the main timeline where things are going to become a little more complicated, but also very interesting. And I have no idea why there is a dinosaur down there. The highly contentious Civil Rights Act was part of Kennedy administration's agenda. But by 1963, it had stalled in Congress. The Dixie Democrats were very, very much against it. And after Kennedy was assassinated, LBJ, who was a master of the Senate, pushed the civil rights agenda forward. And 2 days before the Civil Rights Act was to be voted on in the House, the word sex was added to one of the titles, which was known as Title VII. So there are many acts to this law, and one of them concerned private sector employment, and that was Title VII. And the word was added by an individual who's pictured here, who's named Howard Smith. And Howard Smith was a Democrat of Virginia. He was an ardent segregationist. And probably before the act was being voted on, before he knew it was going to be voted on, when it was just being bantered about, he actually said to others, and I actually have a letter that indicates that he did, that he was going to have this poison pill and put sex in Title VII, and therefore it would fail, okay? It would no longer be an act for civil rights. It would be an act for women's rights, and no one was considering that very seriously. But in fact, The fact that he did it 2 days before it was going to be voted on shows very clearly that that is not why he eventually did it. In fact, women in the House of Representatives, there were very few of it, but there were some, had wanted to add the word sex to this act. And Representative Martha Griffiths of Michigan noted, she said, if black women were to be protected at work, white women should be as well. And the fact that Smith knew that this was going to be voted on and probably go through, at least in the House, it meant that black women were going to have rights that white women didn't. LBJ supported adding the word sex, and the law was passed in 1964, although in the Senate it led to an extremely long filibuster. The word sex appears only in Title VII, which I said concerns private sector employers. With Title VII, the enforcing agency is established that's called EEOC. It's sort of funny, until recently when I would make this presentation, I would read things like EEOC and I would think EEOC exists. I don't even know if EEOC exists anymore, okay? It's not that funny though. So with Title VII, the EEOC was established as the enforcing agency. But when it was established, it actually took no action on account of sex. And the commissioner actually mocked the notion of being a sex commission. Civil rights was really what was important to progressives of that era, and women's rights wasn't. And that led to outrage and the formation of NOW, and NOW began to push for passage of the Equal Rights Act and for real equality, and supported ending this thing called protective legislation. It was a fascinating period in which Republicans and business interests wanted this thing called the Equal Rights Amendment because it would end protection. In fact, Republicans made the ERA part of its national standard in 1940, and the Democrats did somewhat later. And the point is that the ERA was being pushed by Republicans and business interests, and against it were the union leaders and the old-style Democrats. But in fact, it didn't really matter because with Title VII passed in 1964 and interpreted in various ways by 1968, state protective legislation was essentially dead letter. And the ERA then passes overwhelmingly in 1972. Overwhelmingly is really quite amazing. So it passes the House and the Senate sort of overwhelmingly. And in fact, in its first year, it gains 30 states to ratify it. It needs 38. That's 1972. In January of 1973, the Supreme Court gives a big surprise and actually passes or decides on Roe versus Wade. And many other women's rights were passed with sturdy majorities, and the women's movement was on a roll. But with something to attack, something called the Stop ERA movement began, and the pro-life movement was reinvigorated, and the ERA later dies by 1982. But women won a lot in the meantime. For example, they won Title IX of the 1972 Education Act, which prohibits sex discrimination in all federally aided education programs, which is, once again, one of these things that's being used against Harvard right now. And they won the EEO Act, and the EPA was amended to include a very large group of employees. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed, prohibiting sex discrimination in credit credit and mortgages. In 1975, the Supreme Court says women cannot be excluded from juries. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act was passed in 78, and so on and so forth. So women won a lot. And to make more sense of this complicated history, I've compiled what historians and legal scholars and my own reading have determined were the most important moments, including legislation and judicial decisions and major events and turning points and prominent individuals. And I've aggregated them here to 5-year periods and then graphed. And about 45% occur in this brief period between 1963 and 1973. I also put them in various categories thinking that it would matter, but it doesn't matter at all. Now, what I want to do is sort of step back and think a little bit more abstractly, and I think it's useful to think about the rise of the women's rights movement and the reinvigoration of an anti-feminist movement in terms of a model of public support. The model acknowledges that women are difficult to organize. They are in every family, every income class, religion, race, ethnicity, and probably in the US in every zip code. They do not see that much can be done about their circumstances until an organization appears for them to work for. So let's assume, to understand this, that individuals adhere to one of two principles. They adhere either to equality between the sexes or they adhere to a certain set of differences. And each individual has 1 unit of time per period to use for leisure or for working toward one of the things that it believes in, equality or differences. Call the first group feminists, for whom equality with men is valued, and call the second group traditionalists, for whom differences are valued. And I will put their preferences here on the same graph just for simplicity, with feminists going in the positive direction to the right and traditionalists going in the positive direction to the left. The two groups initially have latent demands that get expressed when an organization is formed. So the equality PDF here, probability density function in blue, gives the distribution of feminists by their demand for equality, which determines whether each will give effort to support an organization, work for the organization, demonstrate for the organization, for example. And each feminist has a desired value of E. Let's say here, EERA. And a woman at EERA will give her time only if the current value of E is less than that. Therefore, after EERA is passed, after the ERA is passed, feminists from E0 to EERA will no longer give their time to the movement, and the movement will seem more radical in its support. So why go out and demonstrate if you believe that what you wanted has already been won? And similarly, each traditionalist has a desired value of differences, of D, and will work for differences when the level is below their desired level. And this group was also difficult to organize, but was energized by the passage of the ERA also by Roe versus Wade. And it formed something called the Stop ERA movement, where stop means stop taking our privileges. And this was well-known. Phyllis Schlafly was one of the leaders. So a person at D1 will work for differences when the current value is less than that. So I will return to this little model in a moment, but now what I want to do is turn to what the population, what the nation's electorate believed in. And to make this simple, I will just have 4 groups. I will have men, I will have women, I will have individuals who are between 20 and 34 years old. They're considered younger. And I'll have individuals who are between 35 and 64, and they will be considered older. So let's see what they thought of women's roles and women's rights from the 1940s to as recent as the data will allow me to take it. And some of these opinion poll questions are really very well known. And I'll provide a useful summary at the end, giving the year when the median person in each of these 4 groups that I've just mentioned, men, women, older, and younger, when each of these 4 groups, older men, older women, younger women, when the median person agreed with the question. The first 4 questions concerned women's competencies and role. And I'll begin with one of the very best known ones. Should a married woman work for pay if her husband can support her? Of course, it depends upon what type of support. No one ever says. What type is just support, I guess, support. And so should a married woman work for pay? So the series, as you can see, begins in the 1930s, very, very low, and it remains low. This is really very interesting, even after women entered the labor force during World War II. So this shows more than anything that, in fact, American women were not going to stay in the labor force. This is after the Depression in 1945, you can see. So even women opposed married women's working. And so men's views, that's in the blue, are not that much different. So note that there is no data from 1945 to 1970. And in 1970, the fraction supporting is substantial, especially for the younger group. And so 2 details here are striking. The first is how similar the answers are by sex, and the second is the large change sometime between 1945 and 1970. And as you'll see from the other data, it's probably sometime in the late 1960s. A related question, and one that provides clues to the meaning of the previous one, is the following. It's do you agree with a preschool child would suffer if the mother works? Believe it or not, this question is still asked in the World Values Survey. So even as late as 1977, when this question was first asked in the GSS, the Generalized Social Survey, 80% of men, of the older group of men, and almost 70% of the women who are in the older group, believed that the child would suffer. That doesn't mean necessarily that they think the woman shouldn't work, but the child is going to suffer. The fraction is substantial even for the younger group, and it's substantial even in the 2000s. The great divide in opinion about women's work concerns young children. Another informative question is whether the U.S. would be better governed if women were more politically active. We're not quite certain what that means, but initial differences by sex disappear by about 1970, and the vast majority agree that America would be better governed if women were more politically active. And finally, here is the big shocker. whether the respondent would vote for a female president if she was running in the party the person usually voted for. And this question was asked more times than any other in the GSS. And we can see the great change that occurred in the 1960s here. These 4 opinion poll questions demonstrate that Americans thought women could be employed, although maybe not with young children, that the country would be better governed with more women in public office, and that women could become president. Similar with regard to, so let me do, move over here. Yeah. So what we're going to see is that even though Americans thought women were exceedingly competent, they were less willing to give them the reins of government and the reins of business. The next 3 questions concerned whether women should be granted more equality. So the first question is, should women be granted an equal role in business, industry, and government? And of interest is the somewhat higher fraction of women agreeing, however, we should be struck by the general low level of agreement until pretty late, until the 1990s. Similarly, with regard to a person's warmth for the women's movement, it was rather tepid until the 1980s. And finally, worse yet, was agreement with the main tenet of the movement that men and women were equal, or the word feminism. The word feminism is, in fact, one of the most misunderstood words in the English or possibly any other language, okay? Because it simply means that men and women are equal, and yet it has become, in the English language, the F word, okay? So in the year 2000, fewer than 30% of women would accept a description as being a feminist. I'm not certain what they thought that this was. But if you go back to the little toy model that I gave you, the problem is that since most moderates had left the women's movement, they viewed the women's movement and feminism as being occupied by radicals. Okay, so the word had become tarnished. So given the time, I'm going to summarize the material with a visual that gives the year in which the majority of group by age and sex, remember the older women, the younger women, the older men, the younger men, but rather than using dots, I've used chickens, okay? So where the chicken stops, so here this is vote for a female president. So where the chicken stopped, a blue chicken is an older man, okay? And a blue chick is a younger male. And an orange chick is a younger female. And an orange chicken is an older female. So that's the way it works, okay? So as for the opinions concerning what women are capable of, so is work for pay okay? Should women be more politically active? Vote for a female president. For those, remember, each group has a majority that agrees with the statement fairly early in this time. You can see the latest there is around 1965. And the differences by sex are small. And where the differences by sex are small is when the chickens are on top of each other, okay? Now, in contrast, the majority of Americans agreed, the year that the majority of Americans agreed to give women more rights is much later. And similarly, for the year they agreed with the principles of women's rights groups and with their chief tenet, feminism, which way at the top there never exceeds 50% up until the last year that I have here, which is 2005. But what this does not show are the within women differences, which returns us to the history and to the toy model. Recall that the toy model showed that as a group unifies and gains rights, moderates leave the group, and it will appear more radical and more extreme. At the same time, an opposing group will form. And so this brings me to my penultimate point, which is that women became divided in the 1970s on women's issues far more so than men. And what I show here are divisions by two groups. So this is the answer to the question whether this is a feeling thermometer, which is that it's rate the women's movement, where 50 means indifference, above 50 is support, and below 50 is more of a lack of support. And so what this shows here is that divisions by two groups. So young women who were college graduates versus older women who were not college graduates. Even though men and women in the 1970s had about equal warmth on average to the women's movement, here a value of 47 versus 48, young college women expressed far more warmth to the movement than did older non-college women, and that's about a 14-point difference, and that's quite substantial. However, there was little difference between these groups for men. There was only about a 5-point difference. So there's some difference. And divisions among women were reduced over time. As you can see, I have the 70s, I have the 80s, and then I have the 90s here. But divisions among women were reduced over time, but they remain more divided along different lines than were men. And divisions among women have always been substantial regarding traditions and the proper role for women, and these have continued to be strong. And so my final point concerns international comparisons. So the US had been a leader among nations in terms of women's rights, but it has been a laggard in terms of benefits. For example, here, with regard to employment discrimination law, relative to 5 other OECD nations here, 38 are represented in this graph, but I have pulled out 5 others, okay? So you can see here that the US is the earliest, around 1970, then Britain, Sweden, France, Germany, and Denmark. So that's in terms of employment discrimination law. In terms of sexual harassment laws, you can see the US around 1980, then France, Denmark, Sweden, Britain, and Germany. And this is from the World Bank Women, Business, and the Law compilation. And also with regard to laws regarding no discrimination in credit access. So the US begins in 1974 with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and then we get a bunch of other countries passing equivalent laws concerning credit. But the US is nowhere on this graph for paid parental leave, that's the blue one, and is also very late for, on an average, 14-week paid maternity leave. And the way in which the World Bank is doing that is taking the fact that certain states in the US have paid leave, but the federal government, of course, does not. So let me sum up this complex history that I have told. So in 1960, few recognized that there was discrimination in employment, credit, juries, education, the military, Social Security, and so on with regard to sex. But with the 1960 election, women became a political force, and women began to adopt the term oppression, borrowed from the civil rights movement. But the civil rights movement did a lot more for women, and it fortuitously gave them Title VII and the EEOC. And that led to the formation of the National Organization for Women, otherwise known as NOW. And a huge list of women's rights gains followed in part due to women's electorate clout after 1960. The Supreme Court delivered a surprise gift to the women's movement in January of 1973, recently reversed. And these gains also led to the appearance of a more radical women's movement in the US and the rise of anti-feminist, pro-family, anti-federal government, and anti-abortion groups. And it produced more polarization among women than among men. The next part of my project will be to understand why Americans believe more in rights than in benefits, and whether and how rights actually led to change, although it is hard to believe that the well-being of most women did not improve because of their expansion. It is likely, however, that the actions of the more traditionalist groups have diminished the ability of women to fully use these rights, for example, by preventing funding for universal pre-K and for paid parental leave in the US. But I find it impossible to imagine that my world would be the same had women's rights in America remained as they were in 1962. And I thank you.